Iceland, a country that has approximately 4 times as many sheep as it does people. Morning, sheep. How you guys doing? Can you do me a favor and stay out of the road, please? I don't want you to get hit by a car. You'll encounter a lot of sheep on the road while you're driving around Iceland. You know, as I've spent time here in Iceland, I've been struck by many mysteries. Like, for example, why would anybody want to eat salty licorice? Cheers. Or why does the identical twin cousin of Pablo Barncat live in this country's capital city?
No, seriously, the entire city of Reykjavik has this weird obsession with Pablo. There's drinks named Pablo, there's bars named Pablo, and I swear to God, we saw this cat just hanging out looking like it was Pablo Barncat's brother.
But above all else, I've been struck by this thought of why are things so gosh darn expensive here? Like, it's crazy. Like, if you were gonna go out for dinner at a, you know, like medium caliber restaurant for a modest meal for 2 people with just 2 dinners and no appetizers, nothing like that, you can easily spend like $80 to $100 just having your meal, the 2 of you together. And then even as you go to like a grocery store, you're gonna see that prices are ridiculous.
But seriously, just in an unscientific survey of walking around a grocery store, I would find that prices are easily 50 to 75% higher than what we would pay for similar items here in the United States.
And on the surface, that concept kind of makes sense because this country is an island. And really, for most manufactured goods, as well as most foods, everything has to be imported into the island, usually by boat, but sometimes by plane. And it's not like you can just truck something over the border. Again, this place is an island, so the food's got to come from somewhere and the materials have to come from somewhere. And so that cost of importation definitely drives up the cost. I mean, heck, I was even at a hardware store the other day, and while looking through their version of what would have been like a Lowe's or Home Depot, I found the exact same cordless driver that I use on my farm. And if you were to buy one at the store in the United States, you'd probably spend, I don't know, like $150 or so. Well, for a similar version of that same driver, which is actually even just a little bit less good because they sell the 18 volt here versus the 20 volt flex volt that you can buy in the United States, you would end up spending 86,000 Icelandic krona, which roughly, as I'm recording this, translates into about 628 American dollars. That's absolutely insane. I mean, you could make a killing in the import-export business for drills here in Iceland.
He's an importer.
Importer.
And exporter.
He's an importer-exporter.
Now, obviously, I'm sure there's like tariffs and other taxes that sit on top of that inflate the price, but I feel like that drill example is a good one to just showcase how much more expensive virtually everything is here. Like, the high cost of goods here in Iceland was something that people warned us about as we were planning this trip, but I will admit I'm completely stunned and was not prepared for just the level of expense it was relative to what we're used to in the United States. And when you ask that question of why, most people will tell you it's rooted in the fact that this is an island and most things have to be imported on, which is why if you look at pretty much any island in the world, things are always much more expensive on an island than they are in the mainland. Okay, Morgan, what the heck does this have to do with sheep in Iceland? Please explain. Don't get impatient. I will explain this to you because this all does come together and connect, and I do have a bigger point I want to make. Now, one of the things I have just been absolutely blown away by, and in like a good way, as I've been driving around Iceland and just exploring and particularly seeing the countryside and a lot of the rural areas, is that beyond just the pure natural beauty of things that you're going to be struck by just pretty much anywhere you drive, one of the things you're just going to be overwhelmed by is the amount of agriculture that there is in this country. But for the most part, it is not like the agriculture we have throughout most of the United States. You're not going to see massive fields of wheat or soybeans or corn or things like that. And that's not to say that some of those crops are impossible to grow here, but they are definitely harder to grow here, both in terms of the growing season that they have here, as well as the amount of rain that they get here, as well as if you just try to get into like the quality of the soil that they have here and just how gosh darn rocky it is and not necessarily ideal for growing various types of row crops. And I can only just imagine how awful this soil could be for tractor implements like tillers or seed drills or anything like that. So a lot of those more common forms of agriculture that you're going to see in other parts of Europe or in Asia or in the United States, you're just not going to see a heck of a lot of that sort of thing here in Iceland. But at least by my observations, there are 4 forms of agriculture here that absolutely dominate the landscape. And if you look at this one shot that I'm showing to you right now, you can see 2 of those forms of agriculture at the moment. So for example, number 1, I don't know if you can see those little sheep that are hanging out right over there. And then number 2, as I pan over here, you can see that this field was just recently hayed, and there's a whole bunch of hay bales just sitting on the pasture, and they're ready to be picked up probably later today. The other 2 forms of agriculture that I could probably just drive about a mile down the road that way, or I guess I can't drive miles here, I can only drive kilometers. So let's call it a 1.5 kilometers down that way. That would include raising horses, and that would include raising cattle. And now the very obvious reason why these forms of agriculture dominate the landscape here in Iceland is all 4 of them are essentially grass-based forms of agriculture. Because while it's pretty hard to run a cultivator through a lot of this land, and it's rather cold, and it's got a short, very intense growing season that makes Vermont's short, very intense growing season seem like something that's very even-keeled and middle of the road. The Icelandic agricultural system is fueled by grass. And when it comes to cattle and when it comes to horses, and particularly when it comes to sheep, all of those animals can live off almost exclusively hay and grass. And I know I said that there were 4 forms of agriculture, and I mentioned the hay, but hay actually supports those other 3 forms of agriculture because essentially the hay is just a way of taking a lot of the food that they're going to grow right now in this moment, and they can basically put it in the bank and reserve it for the winter, which is also very similar to how we do things in Vermont. I think the other thing that's worth noting is while you will see plenty of horses and horse farms around here, and you'll also see a fair amount of cattle being raised primarily for dairy, but sometimes for beef, the sheep are absolutely everywhere in this place. You know, particularly if you're driving around the countryside, like for example, right now I'm in like the western part of the country. As you go around, you actually have to be careful because there's gonna be sheep just sort of wandering across the road, and you really wouldn't want to hit one going like 90 kilometers an hour. And sheep have very much been core to Iceland for hundreds of years, pretty much since like really the European settlement started to take hold following the Viking arrival, because it's been core to just how they've managed the landscape, as well as how they've fed themselves, as well as how they've clothed themselves. And in fact, part of the reason why there's so few trees is because of the sheep. You know, the cattle and the horses can live off the grass, and they definitely get their nutrition from the island, and that's something that does not have to be imported in. I believe that the sheep do a better job of living off of the marginal pasture grasses that they have here, because when you're looking at the grass that's out here, it's like not super high quality forage. It's not to say that it's that dissimilar from the stuff that grows on our farm, but it's just not the greatest stuff, and sheep can exist on much more marginal forage. And the Icelandic sheep in particular, which is a specific breed that has been developed over centuries here in Iceland, is really well suited for being very hardy. They're able to easily traverse the mountainous landscape. They're relatively parasite resistant. They don't mind eating the crappy grass. And overall, they're just very, very self-sufficient, which speaks to the way the Icelandics raise their sheep in general. Because unlike farms in the United States, where we'll fence in our animals, and particularly in the regenerative agriculture space, we'll be moving our animals either once or multiple times a day in very specific places on pasture, the way the Icelandics do it is they basically will turn out their sheep and just let them wander and graze the countryside for all of the summer months before bringing them back to the farm and getting them set up for winter in some sort of barnyard area and situation where they can take all of those bales of hay that they grew over the summertime and use that for feed in the wintertime. And while yes, you're going to often find most farms have a variety of forms of fencing of various efficacy scattered throughout the countryside, it's been my experience that these fences are more suggestions than actual hard boundaries. Because again, I just actually have to look in any one direction right now for, I don't know, maybe about half a mile. And what I can see is probably, I don't know, a dozen, 2 dozen sheep just wandering free outside of any fenced-in boundaries. And now I know some of you guys are gonna probably be hearing this and saying, oh my gosh, aren't those folks worried about their sheep? What about the wolves? What about the coyotes? What about the other predators that could attack those poor sheep and lambs? By letting them wander around outside of any sort of hard boundary, aren't they putting their lives at risk? And the answer there is no, because again, because Iceland is an island, there really aren't any major predators here on this island. You know, if you go back, say, 1,000 or 1,500 years ago, before there was really any human activity here on the island, what you're gonna find is the only predator mammal that existed was the Arctic fox. And I don't know how familiar you guys are with Arctic foxes, but they're tiny and they are freaking adorable. And while a puffin needs to be careful and watch out for an Arctic fox, there aren't wild packs of Arctic foxes roaming the western countryside trying to attack sheep or lamb. In fact, because of the relatively closed ecosystem that they have here in Iceland, there really weren't a ton of mammals in general. And it really wasn't until humans came here that rodents like mice and rats showed up. And humans also ended up bringing reindeer here, and they made the horrible decision to actually bring mink to this island for some form of like fur farming, which has been an experiment that has gone horribly awry. And many of those mink, as soon as they got here to Iceland, escaped, and they roam across the countryside wreaking havoc and killing the birds, and they're just like a horrible invasive species at this point. And even the sheep and cattle and horses themselves, they're not native to here either. They were all brought here by Europeans as well. I was talking to one lady who was telling me that there have been examples of polar bears showing up here in Iceland, but those have been few and far between, where I guess like a polar bear could like be on an ice drift and somehow swim over here and then kind of get stuck here, but like it's not a thing that really happens a lot.
And when it does happen, they're usually shot on sight.
And so when it comes to the sheep, they have no natural predators, and so they can very easily wander the countryside pretty safe, and the farmers don't have to worry about their sheep being killed by some sort of animal. And so, like I said, when the weather gets warm, they turn them out. When the weather cools down, they bring them back into the barn so that they can feed them, and that's just pretty much how the sheep life goes. Now, none of this is to say that there aren't downsides to the sheep being able to wander like this, and if you let those sheep numbers go unchecked, it doesn't just mean you've come up with like the infinite food glitch here on the island and you don't have to worry about anything. Because truth be told, the one thing that sheep have done that has been a negative is, again, as you look around this landscape, one of the things you might notice is like that there are very, very few trees. In fact, I actually stopped to record the video in this one spot because this is one of the few places where I could find in this area patches of trees anywhere. All of the trees behind me were probably planted like in the 1980s or later, most likely a lot later. And yes, most of the Icelandic landscape is devoid of trees. And while some of that lack of trees can be attributed to just the landscape and soil conditions and weather conditions here, the rocky soil is not necessarily the best for those trees, and particularly for trees to grow large and put down some deep roots. If you go back, like say, I don't know, like 5 to 15 million years ago, you're gonna find a lot more of Iceland was forested, and that's something that they know from a lot of fossil evidence. But then as the climate here shifted and changed, what you find is that those tree species numbers actually shrunk down significantly. And I think there was like about 5 different types of trees that grow here natively, at least at the point when humans came here. And really most of those tree species were rare. And so most of what they have here are the downy birch as well as a form of willow tree. And when humans really first arrived here and created permanent settlements, what happened is those humans cut down a lot of those birch trees and they used them for construction, and they used them for livestock fodder, and they used them for, most importantly, fuel, in that they were using them for like the fires to warm their homes. But even more significantly, they were using it to create charcoal so that they could do things like work with iron and like do blacksmithing and that sort of thing to make tools and various things that they needed to create and support those homesteads on the island. Because while trade here to the island now in the 21st century can be costly and complicated, it's nothing when you compare to what it was like to bring and import goods here in like say the 1700s. And so if you go back and look at the history, say 1,000 years ago, About 25 to 40% of the Icelandic landscape was covered in pretty large and sizable old growth birch forests. Virtually none of that stuff exists today here in Iceland. And so the main reasons why there's no trees here in Iceland is number one, climate fault, and number two, human fault. But one of the biggest reasons why new forests haven't sprung up in, like, say, the lands behind me here actually can be attributed to the sheep. You see, because in those summer months when the sheep are wandering and grazing the landscape and getting all fat and happy and sassy, living the high life here. And so while they're primarily consuming a lot of the things like the grasses or even like the clovers that they've got here, they also love to nibble and chow down on the young tree seedlings. And so that makes it much harder for new forests to get established. And so when you see tree stands like this, usually they're being created by exclusion through the use of fencing to keep the sheep out. Like even as you zoom in here to this rocky area out here, what you're gonna see are some young tree seedlings starting to pop up. And if they get left alone for maybe another 10 years or so, you might eventually start to get bigger and bigger trees starting to grow and form and maybe create a forest in this area. Which admittedly, I have no idea what the land management plans are for this patch that's right here behind me, but I don't know, maybe that could be what they're planning on doing. But regardless of that, the truth of the matter is those free-ranging sheep do make it much more complicated to try to regrow those trees. See that? Look at those sheep over there. It's so cool to see them just kind of hanging out doing their thing. I mean, obviously they're not wild animals, but it is cool to see them in their habitat. But the moment that they hear me, they get a little bit spooked. And so that's actually why it's hard to get close to the sheep. And obviously it would never be a good thing to harass the animals out here too. So if you ever come to Iceland, just let the sheep be and try to avoid hitting them with your car. But if you happen to be at the grocery store or at a restaurant here in Iceland and you're trying to figure out what to eat, I would strongly encourage you to eat some of that Icelandic lamb. Issues related to reforestation aside, it's arguably the most ecologically conscious food you can eat here on this island. Because of the ecological impact that the sheep have on the land, from a net impact perspective, it's overall positive. You know, as these sheep come through here and they graze down the grass and then they spread their manure on the ground. Essentially what they're doing is they're helping manage the landscape. Their manure is depositing more organic material onto this hard, rocky, lava rock soil that they have here. And while it won't turn this into a savanna anytime soon, overall it's a positive. And yes, producing hay for the sheep requires fossil fuels to mow and to ted and to bale all of those hay bales. And much like I struggle with on my farm, the farms here are predominantly using plastic wrap to wrap those bales so that they ferment, and it just really is the best way to preserve them here in this climate. The ecological impact is significantly better than if you were to think about, say, wanting to eat like a veggie burger that was made with soybeans that were grown in the United States, harvested in the United States, processed and manufactured in the United States, and then shipped over here to Iceland, or even if it was like the European equivalent of that. All of those things would exactly stay the same, and the net ecological impact of the lamb would be drastically lower than the impact of that veggie burger. And then even as you think about other vegetable production here in Iceland, a lot of that production has a much greater carbon footprint relative to, say, practices we might have in the United States. For example, there is like a restaurant and farm here in Iceland that is very, very famous for their tomatoes, and they grow those tomatoes in hothouses, but those hothouses are run through hydroponics. They require a significant amount of electricity both to run the facility as well as to ensure that there's enough warmth for the production that you have inside that hothouse. And so like all of those things have a significantly greater impact than these humble little sheep that are wandering around the landscape doing their thing all summer. And yes, obviously fishing and all sorts of seafoods play a big role in the Icelandic diet, and they have their place as well. But don't discount the impact that overfishing can have on the landscape and what that can do too. And so obviously no diet is a perfect diet, but from an ecological standpoint, there's a strong case to be made for the sheep. And by the way, that is not the same strong case that can be made for, say, like chicken, because chicken or pork that's raised here is arguably probably worse than the chicken or pork that we have in the United States, in that all the feed that they're going to eat has to be brought in here. And unless they're doing extremely small scale hog production, kind of like we do, where, for example, we're using old brewer's grains and apple drops as feed for our pigs. You know, unless you're feeding the pigs like just the waste and they're doing them at a very small scale where like each farm only has a couple of pigs, you're gonna be hard pressed to find a production scale pork operation that is anything remotely sustainable, or find anything that's even close to having decent animal welfare standards here in Iceland. And so yes, I think it's actually wonderful to consume the lamb. You really need to think a lot about choosing anything that's got pork or chicken in it here. And as far as the good and bad with the dairy goes, I don't know, that could probably be a whole other video that I could make on that topic. Now, for those of you guys who regularly follow our farm, just know that this entire rant does not mean that at any point soon I'm going to be getting sheep, but it does make me appreciate when you have agriculture that matches the landscape and context that it is produced in. And so as I think about my farm, the lessons of trying to match exactly what we have from an environment and context are going to be things that I want to keep trying to do more and more of. But I am curious to know what you guys think, so let me know down in the comments. I'd be very curious to hear. Thanks for watching, everybody.